Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I am coming to you this week from the Hokianga region in northern New Zealand. You can maybe hear the ambience of cicadas in the background as I sit in this little converted shed, but bringing you another episode talking about the things that matter. And today we are going to be talking about Sudan. I've been wanting to do this show for a while, actually, because over the last couple of years we've seen the horrors of the civil war in Sudan escalating. And it can be so easy to just see it as another war in Africa and sort of write it off. But of course, for those involved, it's not just another war. But also I wanted to talk about it because maybe it's not as distant from us Australians as we might think, because many people and institutions are pointing the fingers at the United Arab Emirates as being a country with its hands dirty in this conflict, financing the militia, the RSF, to get their hands on some Sudanese gold to, line the gilded luxury of life in some of those Emirates big cities. And it so happens that the United Arab Emirates is actually the biggest buyer of weapons from Australia. And there is a chance that some of those weapons that are committing certainly atrocities, possibly genocide against the Darfur people in Sudan, actually came from Australia. As we will hear later in the show, it's hard to know exactly because of the secrecy around the weapons trade in Australia. I speak to David Shoebridge for that, who is the Greens spokesperson for defence, and is one person who tries to keep Australia's defence exports accountable, as we will hear. But before that, I speak to Huda Fadlelmawla, also known as Huda the Goddess, who is a well-renowned slam poet and community organiser, and has been the driving force between some events called All Eyes on Sudan that have happened in our city of Brisbane recently. And so I speak to her about what the situation is in Sudan. We talk a bit about the recent history of Sudan, which does include an incredible protest movement that removed the former dictator Omar al-Bashir. Unfortunately, it didn't have a happy ending, but it is history worth knowing. And we also speak with Huda about the events she's been organising and what Australian people can do to support our brothers and sisters in Sudan. So it's a packed show. Let's start off by hearing from Huda.
Hello, my name is Huda Fadlelmawla, also known as Huda the Goddess. I am a poet, an educator, and activist based in Mianjin, raised in Yagara Turbo country.
And we have you on the show today because we're going to be talking about Sudan, and you are not just descended from Sudan, but you have been organising events in support of Sudan recently. And so let's start off by talking about what is the situation currently there in Sudan.
So Sudan is actually experiencing a proxy war. And I think it's really important when we talk about the conflicts and the wars that happen on the African continent that we use accurate language, because accurate language means we have context into what's happening. So we had a dictatorship for 30 years, and the people of Sudan, after experiencing living cost elevating and the poor treatment by the dictatorship, there was an uprising and people asked for the turn of the dictatorship. And even though they were successful in being able to do that, what then turned into is a complete conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF, which are a militia that was built by the dictator that is the main cause of what has happened in South Sudan, which has greatly led to the separation between South Sudan and Sudan itself. So the proxy war is a complicated nuance in when we think about Sudan, because a lot of people see it as two Sudanese powers fighting each other for essentially the power to be able to run Sudan, but that is far from the truth. The reason this is referred to as a proxy war is that this war would not be happening if the RSF was not backed by external powers, and the main power that is giving them money and funds in exchange for resources, and specifically gold, is the United Arab Emirates. That is the current state of Sudan. It has been famine, war, displacement, disease, an unfortunate, alarming amount of loss, and of course, an unfortunate but very potent reality that comes with anti-blackness and the Afrophobia that is how we look at Africa as in a peninsula, is the world is silent and is unaware, because the intricacies of war happening in Africa means that it's not as easy to identify who the bad person is. And if the bad person is identified, usually it is one that looks like us being supported by someone who is an outsider. So yeah, that's a very brief gist and summary of what is happening.
So you mentioned there the separation of South Sudan from Sudan, which of course happened in the last couple of decades, and as well as that there was a previous genocide against people of Darfur, which happened about 20 years ago, and the forces in the current conflict were also involved in them, weren't they?
Yes, the RSF was built as a right hand and an extremist group to be able to perpetuate what has happened in Darfur in Sudan. So when people are looking at this current climate, we consider them to be war criminals. They are a huge reason is into that separation and that dictatorship, reinforcing the separation, reinforcing tribalism, reinforcing the segregation of those two communities. And also, the very clear thing was that South Sudan has gold. It has minerals that that dictator needed, that made his position in power and his 30 years of dictatorship possible, is through the massacre of South Sudanese people. It's through the displacement, through the hardship and collapse of that community. And I think to talk about Sudan now without talking about South Sudan would be a completely inappropriate and a misrepresentation of history that led to this point. This war did not start just now. It started when Omar Bashir was being backed up by externals to be able to extract minerals from South Sudan, and through the use of building the RSF to exist. So absolutely, yeah. It is a huge history that people might not know and not connect.
So you have called it a proxy war, and you have mentioned the United Arab Emirates, but I wonder if you can elaborate a bit more on what other parties are involved in stoking this conflict and maybe in some of the atrocities.
Yeah, absolutely. So we identify UAE because they're the most direct and have probably given the most backing to the RSF. But the UK's involvement has been quite drastic, which is why there is Sudanese communities calling to stop the backing and the support. To a certain degree, Egypt was involved in the dialogue and conversation. The US is always in that conversation and rhetoric because of the allyships with the countries that they have that are backing our war. So it's definitely, there is multiple people involved in backing, but I think the degree in which they are involved in kind of puts them at the back. And we see UAE as kind of being the first and fourth front in being able to make the RSF be able to exist and be able to do anything.
So there have been calls for sanctions and boycotts be placed against the United Arab Emirates in response to this. I wonder if you can tell us what's the view of people in Sudan about what could be done about this.
Yeah, I was actually just speaking to my cousin in Sudan before I got on this call. There was always such a clear distinction between, I guess, what the priorities are of maybe some people who are living in Sudan. And I think sometimes the conversation of like what could be done might not had as much space. I think sometimes it is the privilege of the people outside to be able to kind of prioritize the sections and to be able to push it forward. But I think recently there's been videos resurfacing from Sudan where the United Arab Emirates has tried to provide aid and like provide food, and the Sudanese community has responded by refusing to go or going and essentially just calling them out, like, how can you support our war and come and feed us like we're the poor when you are the reason we're poor? So the Sudanese people on the ground recognize and understand that the people who rob and kill you and support the people who rob and kill you would then come to be your savior. And I think now that the United Arab Emirates is responding to the heat that they're receiving through going, well, we're going to go give aid as a form of support to kind of rewrite the narrative and show that we are not complicit, it's very telling. And I think every Sudanese person, it is also complicated because United Arab Emirates has notoriously had some of the biggest influx of refugees or migrants that are Sudanese that have moved there. And they moved there because of like the Arabic language being a similar context and them feeling like they could definitely have a better life and work and be employed. So there is a lot of Sudanese people that are still living in United Arab Emirates while at the same time having to call on the boycott because the country they're living and residing in is the country that is backing the complete carnage that is happening back home. So I think like the nuance becomes complicated for everybody based on where they're located and what privilege they have to be able to scream for the sanctions of the United Arab Emirates. But I think there's an agreement that if they're not held accountable, that nothing can stop. And until there are steps mediated, then this will just be a consistent reality for everybody involved. So, yeah.
There has been, I guess, some rhetoric online about, a boycott Sudan. But in terms of a political movement and, say, other governments trying to take steps towards that, has there been much happening?
No. I think, like, Sudan does not get the backing and the countries verbally stepping out to be able to speak against what is happening and to call for that. And if there has been a call made, it is merely just an attempt to show face. But also I think for people to be able to call for that and to be able to back Sudan and what it needs to be able to see the liberation that it deserves, I think people would then have to actually look at what is happening in Sudan and not just see it as a conflict between two Sudanese people. And a lot of the countries around the world cannot be an admission of that because they still see Sudan as a country that's always been in poverty and war. So, like my community doesn't feel like it has any international backing. Sudanese people make up the second largest demographic of refugees from Africa in so-called Australia. And there are still people right now in Australia, while us being around, that still don't even know where Sudan is on a map, let alone that there's a proxy war happening for it. So imagine the people that have proximity not being able to understand or never having searched, let alone people on the external and bigger powers that just are like, why would this be our problem? Why would we care about what's happening in Sudan? See how long it took for Palestine to get the type of conversation or the type of global attention that it did. What has happened in Palestine has been happening for 75 plus years. And only now in the recent years have we seen global attention and global conversation.
So one link that we can draw between Australia and what's happening in Sudan is that Australia exports a lot of weapons to the United Arab Emirates, and we will be talking later in the show to David Shoebridge about the likelihood of Australian weapons going to Sudan. But what's your thoughts about this country that you call home now potentially playing this role in the conflict in your mother country?
Yeah, it's the greatest internal conflict of a refugee and immigrant that their country is immediately and, like, I guess hopefully to people now visibly going through a genocide, is that when you are living in the country in which I guess your own existence and own growth contributes to its government's growth, meaning that furthers how much negative impact they're having on the country you call home. It is a conflict. Yeah, it is a tricky nuance to try to make sense of. And I think the only way I've been able to gravel with is how can I help my community and educate and create understanding and a certain level of compassion for my people through being here. And, to also recognize the solidarity that has come from the First Nations community for Sudan, even if the actual historical context might not be privy to them, as having the Turbu family come through and do a welcome to country at the Sudanese rally we ran a few months ago. To me, that is how I try to make sense of it, is that there is a solidarity between myself and my community and the First Nations people. So I think the ability to be able to tie those things and be in solidarity with both communities, I guess, makes it the conflict a little bit easier to deal with. But it is definitely nuanced. And yeah, it feels like sometimes you are shaking hands with the enemy while at the same time trying to wipe your hands and try to do good right after that handshake. It is complicated.
Now, I want to go back in time a little bit because, as you've said, people in Australia don't know very much about Sudanese history, including quite recent history. But back in 2019, there was an incredible non-violent protest movement to overthrow Sudan's dictator, Omar al-Bashir. Can you tell us a bit about that movement?
Yeah, so in April 2019, there was months of protest in an attempt to remove Bashir, ending his 30 years of dictatorship. And it was where we saw community gather in such a powerful unifying way to ask for humans to be heard, and they asked for peace, liberation, and justice. They asked for freedom. They asked for progression. I think whenever we talk about one of the most powerful things, I can't remember her name right now, but it's a big photo that went around of the Sudanese woman in the white tobe standing on top of the car. But we really saw black women on the forefront of these protests in a way that I don't think we've seen before on a global stage, where we saw a Sudanese woman dressed in Sudanese attire in the Arabic language on top of a car, chanting at a protest. We saw people stand up and call for change and ask for it. And to see that through that peaceful protest, that they were able to get rid of 30 years of a dictatorship through collective. And I think it really should highlight to the world, when we talk about rallies being this disturbing thing and, road blockage and what does it really do? This is what it's really done. It's created change for Sudan. And not that we're anywhere where we intended to be, but I think that movement it spoke to the world and Sudanese people throughout the globe. That those people standing on those streets, and I was actually in Sudan 2019. I was visiting for my cousin's wedding, and I was sitting on the second, third floor. People had been calling all day to us, and the streets, people were rallying. There was tires burnt. There was people chanting. There was people leaving work. And I saw my whole family, my whole neighborhood, my whole street that my mother grew up on, that my family grew up on. I saw everybody go, nah, this is enough. And I will never forget those weeks of we had no internet, no contact with the world. And Sudanese people weren't worried about visibility, even to be like, hey, look at what we're doing and get behind us. They were like, nah, we've had enough. People can't even afford bread. People are making less than what they would use for rent. And in that couple of weeks I was there in 2019, I saw my whole country come together. And the most powerful, succinct, it was like they all had a conversation and decided time was now. No one was too young or too old to protest. No one was tired. People built the energy to be able to move that forward. I think it will always be such a significant memory to me. It reiterates the power of my people, is that they don't want to be victims. And in that moment, they were thinking about liberation and justice and peace and ending what they have been told they should get used to, which is this dictatorship and its impact on its community. I think it was unbelievable. And as someone who experienced that in real time, it should be an iconic thing we talk about, is seeing people gather in this way and do what no one was able to do in 30 years.
Yeah, it was an incredible time, and I remember from afar following it and seeing these huge sit-ins happening day after day, sort of bring the city to a standstill. But unfortunately, it didn't take very long after the regime change for there to be some extreme violence against protesters by the RSF. And of course, as we've said, the situation now is terrible. I guess looking back, are there other ways that it could have gone? Do people in Sudan feel like there was something else that needed to happen?
Oh, absolutely. People wanted democracy. They wanted the dictatorship to be gone, and they wanted a government that is for the people, by the people, and to be able to create some changes. And that is not where we thought we would be after 2019. That now these two powers would be fighting each other at the expense of the people. That isn't where they thought they would be. And I mean, like, in that time, we had a temporary, prime minister that came and left. Before the split of the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, they were working together and they were trying to move this thing along. And they were the ones who together attacked those people that had peaceful protests. They were the ones who were violent first. And then they wanted to reiterate the same thing that Omar Bashir did. And both of those leaders of the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces wanted to lead the movement. And now that is the catalyst of what we're dealing with. Is each of them wants power at the expense of the people that they said they were there to protect. I mean, the RSF was never there to protect the people, but it is an interesting rhetoric to see that is not where the Sudanese people thought they would be. They did not think this would start 600 days worth of famine, displacement, and disease. They did not think they would still have no voice. They would still not be heard as much. They would have to go back a bunch of steps before they can move any more forward. Because right now, things have gotten worse before that they could hopefully get better in the future. So it's definitely not where it was intended to be, but we needed to get rid of that to then be able to look at what is the residue that is left over, which is those people fighting for power. And for a lot of people's reference, a lot of Sudanese people do not want the army to lead. There is no good power in this. Both those sides are not good people. They all worked under a corrupt system. They all hurt, killed, and completely destroyed communities. In this instant, people are trying to pick the lesser evil of the two, but they're both evil.
And now, recently you have been organising some All Eyes on Sudan rallies and fundraisers. Do you want to share with us what they're about and why you think that's important?
Like I said, we've had 600 days of a proxy war, and I think there has been probably in that time in Mianjin probably 2 rallies, maybe 3, including my own. And you can say, well, the Sudanese community hasn't done anything, but also a lot of people are afraid to bring their concerns and their fight for their country here because they don't know how it's going to be received and how they're going to be backed. And that a lot of the times they're being asked to choose what country they identify with and who they would defend and stand up for. And also another side to it is the African community, the Sudanese community is dealing with immediately helping their family members that are living there, that are sick, displaced. They're dealing with loss. They're dealing with having to be the external support system while all of this is happening. So they haven't had the space and the privilege and the time to be able to action anything beyond just that immediate, like, oh, I got a parent who has diabetes. I've got a parent who has, was injured during fleeing. I have a family member who's, what I mean? They're immediately been responding. So I think what I wanted to do was to raise awareness and educate the general public about what is happening in Sudan, to be able to garner solidarity and to be able to help with mutual aid and support Sudan and being able to get that push. And to be honest, for a while, I kind of was like, I'm immediately supporting community and my own family and dealing with the loss I've had. So somebody else is going to lead this and have movement. And some people did try on a very community-based level, but to the level we needed, nothing was really happening in the city. And I was like, let me give an opportunity for reach. And I had an event and a fundraiser. And it did well. People came and there was a community engagement and we had a panel. And then in the learning, in the time that I had that first event, I realized that you cannot humanize a people that you have never experienced outside of war, unfortunately, for a lot of people. I wanted to invite people into the house of a Sudanese person. I wanted them to listen to the music. I wanted them to eat the food, to meet the aunties. I wanted them to feel a sense of home within us. I wanted them to see us and to be able to draw connection and understand who you would be standing up for, who would be advocating for, who you'd be building solidarity with. And to also, I think that is a way to unravel this anti-blackness that had been indoctrinated, what you expect them to be like or how they behave. And that last fundraiser we had a room full of the ethnic diversity, we've had the queer communities, we've had all marginalized people, and then also non-marginalized people in the same space with one agreement in mind, which is we care and we want to learn. And that invite was not about you coming, being informed, because I think sometimes what stops people from these spaces is, well, I don't know enough to show up. And it's like, no, you show up to know more. You don't have to go only when you know everything. That space is about conversation and education and resource building, and that is what it's designed for. So I want to create opportunities for the art communities that are always pouring into these, that have been pushing for Palestine, that are now pushing for Sudan. I wanted to be able to connect with them and go, what can we do that is within our range, within our capacity, that can go further? And through that event, I had like more than 10 art donors around so-called Australia. That when I have an art piece, you can put it up for a raffle. I had people coming, like, I have 30, 40 volunteers that went, hey man, like I can set up, I can bring cushions, I can be one of the people that help with the rally, I can help push social media if you have a mutual aid. I know people and I saw community gathering. The aim is to have community that is outside of the Sudanese people care, understand, and push this through. My community is still grieving. They are still dealing, they're still helping, they're still supporting. This is not over for them. And I wanted to build a door for the people that wanted to help to come in. I wanted to encourage that if you don't know today, that can change tomorrow. And if there is anti-blackness to do today, that doesn't have to be you tomorrow. This is an invite for change. And I want to continue that. You know, me and Black Ink, the poetry collective I run, we are committed to creating engagement and creating opportunities for people to support. Like Ramadan is coming up, and I'm about to do a real and a silent auction to be able to get 50 Sudanese families that are still living in Sudan to get some packages and food supplies for Ramadan, and to be able to then look at how we can create supplies for people that have high blood pressure and need consistent medication, that have diabetes. I also met an artist and an activist from Nairobi who's working with a local community there with Sudanese refugees. And I said, what can we do to be able to support that service center that is helping Sudanese refugees? How can we create a reel that will be seen by 50,000 people if everybody donated $5, $10, and we're able to do that for a month and keep that reel going? We can then help Nairobi's community that is helping Sudanese people. We can reach out to Cairo, we can reach out to Ethiopia, we can reach out to Sudan, and we can keep things happening. And if I can do this and inspire other people that are not Sudanese to do the same thing and help the momentum, that was the goal. If we all do just a little bit, a lot of differences can be made. But if we all feel shame about only being able to do a little bit, then nothing at all will happen.
Okay, well, if people have seen what is happening in Sudan and want to find out more or want to get involved, what do you think they should do?
I would say a very, very quick thing, because I think sometimes education and like all of these stuff is really dense. If you are on Instagram, London for Sudan is a great page to follow that has a lot of information and insight. And they have the resourcing in their actual bio. But if you also follow Mianjin for Sudan as an Instagram page, we are going to put together a resourcing list for people to be able to engage. But if you don't know anything, start with something that is digestible and small to give you an idea of what is happening. So social media is a great step to be able to learn more. But I also want to encourage, please learn about Sudan outside of the proxy war that is happening now. Because to be able to ride for it and be in solidarity, learn about its history, learn about its 200 plus pyramids that we have, learn about how hibiscus we drink in Sudan cold for the summer days, learn about incredible activists and feminists in Sudanese culture that have been amazing. Listen to people like Wardi, an incredible musician who is an icon for Sudanese music. Engage with Sudan beyond the war. Because if you only know it as the war, I think a lot of the times that's where the exhaustion and the pause and support happens. If you know it for its beauty as much as of the tragedy of what is happening to it right now, you'll be able to move forward. And damn, you listen to this interview, you're already a bunch of steps ahead for a lot of people who might not even know about what's happening. So you've already done the first bit of work. I hope that this has inspired you to do even more.
Thanks, Huda, for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been an absolute.
We have been speaking with Huda Fadlelmawla about what's going on in Sudan now, and about some of the history, and also about what she has been doing in Brisbane to try to offer her support and to try to bring community together and unlearn some of the prejudices that some of us might have against people from certain places. Of course, you may remember a few years ago the moral crisis about Sudanese gangs that was used by Peter Dutton and compliant media to find a handy scapegoat. But Huda, in all her work, is trying to heal some of those divisions and support young African men as well, who often disengage from their schooling and their community. You can follow Black Ink is her poetry collective, which does have a social media presence, and I think there's Mianjin for Sudan on social media to find out more about what they're doing. But for the rest of the show, we're going to be speaking with David Shoebridge, who is a federal senator and the Greens spokesperson for defence, and he's also somebody who has been doing more than most to track Australia's weapons exports and where they go, and whether some of them are going to the atrocities being committed in Sudan. And so let's have a listen to David.
Senator David Shoebridge, the Greens National Defence and Foreign Affairs spokesperson.
And today we are talking about the United Arab Emirates and Australian arms exports. It has come under, I guess, attention recently because of circumstances that we'll get to. But it is the case that the UAE is Australia's biggest buyer of Australian weapons. I guess, can you tell us what kind of things does Australia sell to the United Arab Emirates?
I'd love to give you a clear list of exactly what weapons Australia sends to the United Arab Emirates, but the federal government refuses to provide any such list. We often find ourselves relying upon UN data, which tracks international arms trades, to find the scale of our data. We have historically got the number of permits, defence export permits to the United Arab Emirates from the federal government, but in the last 18 months, the federal government has even been refusing to provide the number of current defence permits. So I can't tell you the exact nature of Australia's defence exports to the United Arab Emirates, but I can tell you elements that we do know. We do know that the volume is high, in the many, many millions of dollars. And we do know that some high-profile Australian weapons manufacturers, most notably a company called EOS, which has its manufacturing based in Canberra and Queanbeyan, we know that they have a very large footprint in the United Arab Emirates and a number of contracts to produce weapons systems with UAE defence companies.
What's the government rationale for the secrecy around this?
The Labor government says that there are commercial in confidence provisions and national interest reasons why they won't provide details of the weapons being exported. But of course, we know that that is, sorry to use the word, complete bullshit, because the United States provides that level of data. They provide details about the weapons types that are exported, the value of the weapons exports, and they provide it for their global exports with a degree of detail that totally shames the Australian government. Other countries, European countries, the UK, provide far more detail about their weapons exports than Australia does. It's really the Australian government desperately trying to not face legitimate criticism for selling weapons to some of the most questionable regimes on the planet. The arguments used by the government are obviously false, but they're convenient. They're convenient to both Labor and before them the Coalition to protect Australians' weapons exports from proper scrutiny.
So the weapons going to the United Arab Emirates probably wouldn't have caused much of a fuss until quite recently, where there's a lot of evidence being offered that the United Arab Emirates is contributing substantially to the RSF militia in Sudan in the civil war, which is committing horrible atrocities in Darfur. So I wonder if there's much evidence of Australian exports going to Sudan.
There are multiple concerns with Australia's exports to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. The first is the United Arab Emirates has a very poor record of human rights abuses and war crimes in their intervention in the civil war and the conflict in Yemen. That would be reason enough not to send weapons to the United Arab Emirates. That appalling history and record of their involvement, some of it ongoing, in the conflict in Yemen. But we also know that the UAE is taking a very active role in proxy wars that it and other countries are fostering inside Sudan. And the United Arab Emirates and other countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other neighbouring countries of Sudan are engaged in a proxy war, some would say proxy wars inside Sudan, largely to access Sudanese resources, particularly its mineral wealth, but also to try and control some of the Red Sea access for Sudan as well. And those proxy wars have led to some of the most appalling killings, most recently allegations of genocide against the RSF, one of the armed militia groups inside Sudan. And those allegations of genocide are backed up by horrific satellite images of piles and piles of bodies in places that have been put under the control of the RSF, the former Janjaweed militia inside Sudan. So the UAE, though, is criticised because of its, some would say, utterly mercenary approach to the conflict in Sudan, extracting large amounts of gold in particular from Sudan. And interestingly, shamefully, the UAE has at different times funded both the formal Sudanese army, the SAF, as well as the insurgent militia, the RSF, sometimes funding them both at the same time and driving the conflict in Sudan. And there is unquestionable evidence of weapons being fed in by the UAE and wealth being extracted largely in the form of gold reserves out of Sudan by the UAE. It's a shameful record which Australia should have no part in, but unfortunately, as I think I said, EOS, an Australian weapons manufacturer, has that large footprint in the UAE, and many are pointing the finger at them and saying they're a significant part of the problem.
Now, as well as a politician, you are also trained as a lawyer, I understand, and so I wonder if you can tell us, legally, what is Australia's responsibility around this? If we're exporting weapons to UAE and they're being involved in war crimes in Sudan, what does Australia need to do?
Australia has obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, which we're a party to track our weapons exports, to not send them to parts of the world where there are human rights abuses and conflict like we see in Sudan. And Australia's obligation doesn't end when we export weapons to a third country, such as the United Arab Emirates. We are then meant to track whether or not that country, in this case the UAE, sends their weapons on to another country to engage in conflict in yet another country. Yet Australia has a woeful history of not following where Australian weapons ultimately end up, simply exporting them to the UAE and then, wiping our hands of them. Now, even the United States does better than that. The United States insists upon countries who they export weapons to getting their active consent before those weapons can be sent to a third country. But Australia does nothing like that. And again, that's in breach of the Arms Trade Treaty and is a breach of international law by Australia. But, when it comes to enforcing the Arms Trade Treaty in Australia, we can't just bring the treaty into a court, the federal court or the High Court in Australia. The law in Australia says that those international obligations are only enforceable in Australia to the extent that the Parliament has legislated for them. And there's just a big gap in our weapons export control laws. that basically give the government a get-out-of-jail-free card. They export them to the UAE, and then they just simply try and deny all moral responsibility for where they go after that. But I don't think the Australian public accepts that.
No, well, an interesting correlation to all this is what's happened over the last few years around Australian weapons exports to Israel, which the government has repeatedly sort of denied happen. But in recent months, we got reports that weapons companies had been told that they would have to cease selling weapons to Israel. Do you have any more info about that? What's happened with that?
We understand that those directions from the Department of Defence went to a number of smaller arms manufacturers in Australia, prohibiting them from engaging in weapons trade with Israel. But of course, we again hit the wall of secrecy from the Albanese Labor government, refusing to give details, public details about what companies have been contacted, and refusing to provide any level of detail about what weapons and weapons parts have been exported to Israel. We do know, though, from sources totally unrelated to the government, that there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of flights sending weapons pretty much straight from a large F-35 regional depot in Australia, in Williamtown, just near Newcastle in New South Wales, into Nevatim Air Base in Israel to keep the Israeli F-35 fighter jet fleet in the air, able to bomb and kill. And of course, the Albanese government refuses to accept responsibility for that, saying that's a matter for the United States and the United States government, seeming to ignore the fact that these weapons parts, some of them are made in Australia, but the regional hub is based in Australia, and weapons exports from Australia should be the subject of close scrutiny by the Australian government, not by whatever administration exists in Washington from time to time.
But it does suggest at least that the public pressure on the government has had some effect around weapons to Israel. And so I wonder if you could, for the ordinary person who's seeing what's happening in Sudan and feeling like it's so far away from us, I guess what should we be doing to try to influence this in the best way we can?
I'd ask members of the public to inform themselves about, as best they can, about what is happening. We put on the public record in the course of an exchange in a process called Senate Estimates, where as a senator I get to ask bureaucrats questions and hopefully get some answers about what the federal government is doing. And it was about a half-hour exchange with defence officials where I put to them what we knew about weapons exports from Australia to the United Arab Emirates. So I put to them what we knew about an Australian weapons manufacturer, EOS, that I mentioned earlier, about how they had arrangements to sell their rapid-firing turret, which has been developed and manufactured in and around Canberra, which can attach rapid-firing rockets, rapid-firing missiles, rapid-firing cannons, rapid-firing machine guns, and target and kill people, 2 or 3 kilometres away. That EOS sells those weapons systems, those turrets, to 2. They have contracts with 2 UAE weapons manufacturers. One of those weapons manufacturers makes armoured vehicles that it sells to the Sudanese army, the SAF. Another one of the UAE weapons manufacturers sells armoured vehicles to the RSF, the militia, who are in conflict. And EOS sells turrets to both of those manufacturers. How do I know this? I don't know this because the federal government has told us. I know this because EOS announced those deals in media releases that they published in the United Arab Emirates, celebrating those weapons contracts. Of course our government should be putting a close eye on this, and of course our government should be saying in the clearest possible terms that no Australian weapons should be being put on platforms in the UAE and then exported to conflicts in Sudan. Now, I can't tell you for sure that those turrets have found their way into Sudan, but what I can tell you is EOS has been celebrating those 2 contracts with those 2 UAE weapons manufacturers, and the history of their exports is uncontested.
All right, thanks very much, David.
No worries, Andy. Good speaking, and thanks for the interest.
You are listening to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, and we have been talking about the conflict in Sudan and Australia's role in it, selling weapons to the United Arab Emirates, who I think regardless of whether those specific weapons are going to commit the horrendous atrocities in Sudan or whether it's other weapons, I think there should just be a case for an arms embargo against a country that seems to have been happy to support war crimes happening. And I think there really needs to be a bit more of a campaign around this. Of course, it took a long campaign about Australian weapons going to Israel to eventually get anywhere regarding that. And as David said there, it's hard to measure what happened. The government wasn't willing to kind of say that the protesters were right and that we should stop sending weapons there. It was all hush-hush. But it might be a tough slog to do the same for Sudan, but of course so important. And I think, what kind of Australia do we want to be living in? What do we want our contribution to the globe to be? Do we want it to be weapons that can be used, in any war really, but in some truly terrible wars? Is that what we want to be the work of our hands and what our nation is known for? I don't think it is. And so let's try to make an Australia that's known on the global scale for something a bit more constructive, and part of that could be working to create peace around the globe and being a country that's known for that. So it's a big ask, but it might start with you and I, and maybe with us getting a bit more informed about Sudan, which I hope this show has helped you to do, and then taking some action to support the ordinary people of Sudan caught in the crossfires of, warring factions in their country, and of course the interests of other nations around the globe. And as I did say earlier, Huda Fadlelmawla, who was our guest earlier in the show, has been organising a few events for Sudan, and I think she has quite a big social media presence, and so follow Black Ink, her page, to find out more there. That's all we have time for on the Paradigm Shift. I will, of course, be back next week. There are so many things going on around the world to keep track of, and it can be very tragic, I guess, at the moment, reading the news, but I think we need to balance it with the empowerment of knowing that every day we can be part of making a better world. And so I hope you can remember that amongst all of the bad news. I'll see you next week.